Okay, welcome to today's event around in-database processing. Today we're going to walk you through building an in-database workflow. Now, due to some of the restrictions of working with the database and demoing that, unlike our previous live trainings where we usually provide you the workflow, we will not in this case just because it requires a database instance that everybody can connect to, which we don't have in this case. So what I'm just going to do is today's going to be demo only, and after this session, if you are interested in just playing with the sandbox or playing with the files after the fact, what I can do is I can send out the source files as they were used as flat files, or I guess the tables that we were using as flat files, and then you could go back to the replay if you wanted to see how we actually achieved it and follow along for that. So we apologize for that, but it is difficult to make sure that everybody is configured correctly to make sure this happens. So we want to take the focus off of that and make sure we keep the focus on in-database processing, why you might choose to do it, what are the benefits of doing it, and really how to be successful with that. So I'd expect this session to probably run us all the way up to the end of the hour here, right at noon Mountain Time. I will let everybody know by default you are muted, so I will not be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean I will not communicate with you in this session. I do have a Q&A window open at all times. So I will make that note. If you look into kind of your WebEx display, you'll see there's a chat window. And what's a little harder to find is there's a Q&A window. And I am a little bit more of a fan of the Q&A window because I can kind of mark off when a question has been answered, and I can see in my participants list who's asking questions at any time. So I can really make sure that I accommodate to that. So that's what we're going to be having. If you have any questions, just put those into the Q&A. And then the other thing is that the session is being recorded, so we'll have that available for playback after this session. So let's go ahead and get started. And what we're going to talk about first is some of the upcoming offerings that are going to take us out to the end of 2018 and go through some workflow background, and then we're actually going to build that workflow inside a database. So I think all of you know the benefits of community here, especially as it pertains to Academy. But if you want to find out more, especially around these in-database tools, because there are a lot of different ways to configure these tools, check out Community. So what we're going to be demoing on today is a local instance that I'm connecting to that's on my own machine of Microsoft SQL Server, which might be one of the more common ones that people have. But I'll show you a slide of all the things that we can connect to. And the steps to connect to them will probably vary based on what you are connecting to. So one of the more invaluable resources that you're going to have is working through that community and seeing who's connected to each of these databases and how it's been successful right along the way. So if that's where a lot of your challenges are, definitely go check out the community and see how people are working through those connections. And candidly, when you're talking about connecting in database, that may be one of the hardest parts to work through, is just getting a connection to your database. And the other one is getting permissions, right? And that's one thing I'll say clearly up front, is that Alteryx does not override any database permissions set forth by your DBAs. So if you cannot read from your database, or you as a user have not been permissed, or to write temp tables or write tables in permanency, you won't get very far, right? So making sure that you're working with the right structure, working within the rules of your organization are really going to be important for you to start kind of joining this movement towards going in database. So upcoming live trainings that we have, next week we're going to be covering off on some fuzzy matching. That's pretty exciting for a lot of people because when things don't match one for one, especially if you have a manual entry system and you're trying to measure close enough on matches, fuzzy matching is the one for you. And then on 12/18, we're going to have a training on dynamic workflows. Dynamic really being, in this case, how do you need to build a workflow to accommodate or not accommodate, both of them important, changing schemas, changing data, how to analyze your data in a way that's very, very repeatable. So the idea being that if it's dynamic enough, you'll never need to open your workflow. You could just schedule it, set it, forget it. Whereas some people who do not build their their workflows very dynamically have to open them and update them every time. So that's what we're going to be covering off on 12/18, and then we start to get into the holiday season. So we're going to scale down those live trainings for the remainder of 2018. Workflow background. So today what we're really going to do is we have a business user SAS file with customer data, and all the transactional data is in the database. And we have no way to blend them together efficiently. So the first point is that I do have a file, a flat file, right, that does not live inside my database. And all of my data lives inside the database. And right now it's the separate sources. I have no way to really contextualize them to each other. How do I blend them together, right? So what we're going to do is take these two files and blend them in database, both of them, and perform a logistic regression to write results to the database. So what these files really represent is the likelihood these customers were to buy based on their transaction history. So what we're going to do is we're going to perform kind of a scaled logistic regression, which has that decision variable of yes or no, how likely are they to be a responder to my targeted marketing campaign. We're going to go ahead and try that out to show you why you might work with a workflow and different ways that you can work through it as it pertains to in-database. So what I'm showing you here is a quick little snapshot of what we're about to build. So you can see already that you might have some familiar tools, like up here in the top left we have an input auto field. We have some predictive tools that you may or may not have worked with, and then we have all of these kind of slate gray, blue-gray colored tools which represent in-database. A lot of these tools you might find if you're already building workflows inside of Alteryx today to be pretty easy to pick up. If you come from a SQL background or database background, you might find it even easier to work with. But there are just little nuanced differences in terms of how you'd work with these tools and what you can expect as you go through them. Okay, so we're going to cover why we would go in database. We'll talk about streaming in and streaming out, what that really means, and how to optimize your workflows. So the first thing is why in database, right? There could be a number of different reasons, the first of which is probably just improving performance. So if you have millions and millions of records that live inside your database, and they're never going to leave your database, right? You might just be doing a filter and creating a view or creating some other table or just doing some simple analysis, and that data never needs to leave outside of that database. Why bring it into the memory of Alteryx and then kind of bring it back to the database, right? So improving the performance means basically that you never have to move that data around. It can just be transformed where it lives at. This can be even more important for people who have geographic disparity from their database system. So if my database is living in California and I'm from New York, the time that it can take to pull that data into my designer could take a long amount of time because I'm going to be sipping through a straw as that data gets pulled out of that database. Whereas if I just left it inside the database, what we're doing is submitting a query back to that database and just running that query there, right? So there's a huge performance gain that stands to be built that way, pending on your needs. The next one is leverage platform investments, right? So a lot of people are using are putting in a lot of money to make sure that their databases are tuned, indexed, running fast, handling volume. There's a lot that goes on, right? And a lot of people pay a lot of money to make sure that everything is running at a very high level. We wouldn't want to ignore a lot of those platform investments, right? We want to make sure that where your organization is putting the emphasis is where you can follow as an analyst. So making sure that we can follow that. And then also, for those of you who come from a background who aren't writing SQL, but are familiar with working with data, right, you can actually execute queries right against the database without a line of SQL code for your line of business analyst. So we'll show you what that looks like. If you do have SQL code, I will say as well that you can use that against the database, and we can talk about that as well. So every time I present this, which is a couple times a year, this slide, I know it, I have it flagged. I always have to come back and update it, mainly because with each and every release of Alteryx, we have a new capability to support in databases. So in terms of workflows that we can build to process data inside that database, this is our comprehensive list. So some of the most recent notable adds, Apache Spark, MySQL, Snowflake, All of those are kind of the newer ones. Now you will notice that with Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and Teradata, those three have asterisks, meaning that we also have predictive data capabilities inside of those. So a lot of these will have analytical capabilities, but none of the predictive suite, whereas Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and Teradata could actually do that inside the database as well. So if you see yours on there, it's awesome. If not, we'd ask you to go to the ideas page on Community, where you can kind of request or present an idea of what database might be helpful based on your background as well. So those are our supported databases for in-database processing. Now, to add on to what I was mentioning earlier, what is really the difference between the in-database tools and the in-memory tools? And I'll say for the duration of this presentation, I kind of call what you think of the typical Alteryx tools as in-memory. That means that it's pulling the data into Alteryx, it's processing that data in the memory of Alteryx itself, and then outputting it to whatever location. So Alteryx is managing kind of that data along the way, whereas in these in-database tools, that would be the database. So I'm going to refer to these as in-memory versus in-database. But you'll see that most of the standard tools, they differ in the sense that they don't have that slate gray color, but in addition to that, they've got a different anchor color. So you'll see that these in-database have little blue anchors, and then in addition, these in-database, the connection between the anchors has that double pipe, nice thick pipeline, so you can kind of see what that looks like. As I mentioned earlier, there's really a few tools in here that are really new compared to what you might be working with in Alteryx. We're going to be talking a lot about data stream in and stream out. ConnectInDB, for lack of a better word, is your input data that you might be used to. It's actually connecting to a table inside of your database, whereas writing your data is actually writing that commit in. And then beyond that, you'll see you have your common perpetrators or your common tools: select, summarize, union, sample, join, formula, filter. And each of these have a little bit of nuanced differences, so as I go along and build out, you can actually see what some of those differences are. Now, just because we can process in database doesn't mean we always should process in database or vice versa. So what I'm showing you here is a hybrid workflow. So many times there are some types of analysis that our database can't support, right? So we looked back at the previous view and we said, hey, there's only 3 databases that support predictive, for example. In some databases, transpose might be a difficult task to do. So what we have the ability to do inside of Alteryx is to kind of move around where that compute context is, right? Is it being computed in database or not? So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm taking my customer's file, I'm throwing a quick autofill to make sure that all my data types are kind of nicely aligned, and I'm actually streaming that into my database, my Microsoft SQL Server, and creating a temp table out of that. And then I'm using that temp table to blend with the table that's already there. And then finally, when I've done all my blending, I'm actually streaming it out for a quick transpose and calling it a day, right? So you can actually continually move back and forth between streaming in and streaming out. Again, based on your geographic disparity, that streaming in and streaming out could be heavy and lethargic based on where you're located or what your Wi-Fi speeds are. So why would I go in database and why would I go standard, right? So what I have here is 2 views. One is an in-memory workflow and the other is in database. In this one, I have an input file, and this input file, if you remember our input data tool, I'll say it's not an input file, our input data tool can connect to databases, right? And it's simply just doing a select all, right? So it's bringing in, 20 million records into our memory, and we have another file of 380 records, we blend them, and we're done, right? Well, we moved kind of 20 million records across a pipe, aka into the memory of Designer, whereas in the in-database instance, right, especially if we can consider how much we can thin down, aka we're only using 225,000 of that. In this case, instead of moving 20 million into memory, why don't I just move the small 380 into my database, leave the 20 million there, blend there, and then output 220,000. So the amount of streaming in and streaming out is way less volume than I would over here in this instance. This case would be 20 million. This one would be whatever the summation of 229,000 plus 380 in terms of total record traffic across my network. So there's never an absolute answer, but the way it usually goes, right, is the smaller data set, where does the big data set live and where does the smaller data set live? Let's kind of leverage in memory or in database accordingly to make sure it's as fast as possible. So let's just jump into some designer training and see some of this in action here. So the first thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to do this pretty quickly here, just because I'm not sure how useful people will find, but I'm just going to bring in a connect in DB. Now, for many of you, you probably don't have this today, but I could just click in here and select my database, right? So in here I have multiple connections, some of them named nicely, some of them not so much. But for many of you, you might not even have a connection. This might be your day one, right? So you can see that we take two types of connections. You can either configure it yourself, or you could have a system administrator send you an in-database file, right, where you could connect to it. This is a very easy way. If you can convince your DBA to do that, it makes it really easy to connect to. But what I'll say is if you don't have any of this anywhere, right, what you're probably going to need to do is create a connection. So I'm going to go to Manage Connections, and you're going to get this dialog here. Now, the database that I'm going to connect to today is my Microsoft SQL Server database. So off the screen here, I'm going to fire up an instance of that, my SQL Server Management Studio, because it's going to have some of the credentialed information that I'm going to need. So it's off the screen here, but what I'm seeing on my other screen, and it won't let me move it, is simply my server name, and I'm using Windows authentication for my Microsoft SQL Server instance. So let's set it up so I can connect to data. And what I'm going to do is go here and select Microsoft SQL Server, because that's what I'll be working with. Choose if it's going to be user or file, connection type. And then here, if you haven't had any connections built before, you would not see anything. In this case, I have 4 different SQL Server connections. I'm just going to delete some of the old ones here. Okay. And let's just create a net new one, right, from the beginning. And do remember that this will be recorded, so if you need to go back, that'll be great. You can always do that. So let's select a new one, right? And I'm going to name this connection. I'll just call this my live training demo connection. So all that's really doing is giving it the name, like what you see here, Expert or Microsoft SQL Server Demo. I'm just giving it a logical name. You can name it whatever you want. For here, you can choose what type of security you want. If you want to encrypt the password for the machine, the user, or allow for decryption as a whole. In this case, the way I'm working on my computer, I'm simply just doing it as a user. Now, here's where the important stuff comes into play, and I would say this can be one of the most difficult types, is making sure that you have the correct drivers installed or downloaded, and some of them will actually download as a part of your database installation if you did one locally. If not, you'll need to go to your administrator and say, hey, which driver am I going to need to make sure that I connect to it? So what I'm going to do here is show you how I'm going to connect to mine. And we have somewhat of a wizard to make sure that everything gets connected. So if I've connected to this in the past, we have these things called connection strings where I can just say, hey, it's going to be the same. I just want a different name for it or a different encryption. But I'm going to do a net new one. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring up what looks like basically a wizard to kind of build out. So I'm going to select which OLEDB provider I want. Again, making sure that I follow my DBA's advice and what I want. And from here, I'm going to start populating in the information that I find from my SQL Server instance. So I can actually go in and say that my server name is this, which is really just my machine name. I'm going to click a refresh. I'm going to say that I am using my Windows authentication, so I don't need any specific username or password. And what it's going to do once I hit that refresh, I can select the database within that server, right? So I actually have a number of databases. In this case, in this training, we'll be working with the master database. So I'm going to select that, and what I will do next is make sure that it works. So I'm going to test that connection, and you'll see that connection has succeeded. I'll select OK, and it'll be done. Okay. So now I've got that whole string that's built for me. Can't imagine typing this out piece by piece. So if somebody else in your organization has successfully connected, right, and you are using Windows AD, maybe you could just update a few of these values to make sure they work. But more often than not, it's easy just to do this. Now, you're not quite done with this InDB connection, because if you ever plan on writing out, you'll need to set up kind of the right parameters. And in fact, if I think I clicked OK, yep, it's going to recommend that I select the right driver. You'll see that SQL Server, there is a driver for a bulk loader, so I could bulk write. For a lot of people, it might be difficult to configure two different drivers in. So in this case, I'm just going to select the same as the read driver. So whatever I set up over here, just use it over here too, and we'll be done. Right. So now I have this new connection name that's popped up, and I'm just going to exit out of this really quick, because I'll just connect to it as if I already had this connection, right? Live training demo connection, and you'll see I get that same exact dialog. And really what this is showing here next is all of the available tables that I have, right? So I'd recommend, a lot of people don't start in this visual query builder. I recommend they start in tables. And on top of that, I recommend that they always hit refresh to make sure that they are getting the latest view of all the tables that exist inside of that database. So I'm going to go ahead and click transactions, and done. I can run the workflow, and I can look at it. This is the first big difference that we're going to run into for InDB versus in-memory. When I click on these anchors, it's not going to show data, right? In order to view anything inside of InDatabase, what I'm going to need to do is put a browse tool, and it's going to essentially cache the records into that browse tool. Now, the reason being, right, when we're doing something in memory, it makes sense that we can store little temp files along the way that represent each anchor, right? What does your data look like at each point? But this really has never left the database, right? So we can't really see into the database. But what this is really doing is this is kind of extracting 100 records more or less into memory, just so we can see it, right? So we can see what's really happening. So my recommendation is, if you are running with these, use them sparingly, and that's why you can actually see that by default it is 100 records. Now, if I were to run this, a second time, I'm not really changing anything. These records are cached within the browse tool, so it's actually not executing queries back against the database again and again and again and again, and it's basically throttled it so it doesn't see a huge number of requests. Now, if I were to do something where I changed the upstream configuration, that's essentially going to clear that cache and rerun that browse tool again. So that's kind of the quick ditty on what that browse tool does. I always recommend using it somewhat sparingly, just so when you're running a lot of workflows, if you had one after every tool and you had 30 tools, right, you'd basically be running 30 things against the database at once that might get you discredited by the DBA. So use caution. So now what I have here is the next step is our select tool. And you'll see right away there are a few differences inside of our select tool. The first of which is that I cannot change data types. Data types, as it pertains to databases, are written kind of formulaically. So those are using cast statements. So if you ever wanted to change a data type in database, which hopefully you shouldn't if the schemas are properly set up, but if you needed to, I would use a formula tool to write in those cast statements. But in this case, it's simply a selection of what you want and renaming what you want. So those are really kind of the as statements if you're familiar with SQL. Now do note, as I do write the select now, I am not changing anything inside the database. This is simply a query. There's no commit. I'm not creating a temp table anywhere right now. The only thing that's really getting generated at this point is those first 100 records. So what this is doing is it's probably still a select all top 100 that's querying against my database right now. So what I'm going to do here is really kind of thin down the fields that I want, and this is always a good practice, right? And this is how a lot of people might use in database, is not necessarily for blending. They might just use it as a filter, right? Let's filter out 90% of the records and just bring in the 10% that I want. That's how many people might be using it. So I'm going to select a few of the fields that I want. I'm going to select unit price. customer ID, and let's say quantity ordered new. Okay, let's take a run on that workflow and look at what we got now. So now I can see my customers, how many units they bought, and at what price they bought it. So this person likely bought $600 worth of merchandise. So now I actually want to calculate that, right? Let's calculate what their total transaction amount is. So let's jump into our new tool that we haven't addressed yet, and this is the formula tool. And the formula tool fits into the same category that our filter tool does, in the sense that anything that you write into the formula tool has to be in the syntax of the database, right? So if there's any hitch in people experiencing or working with the in-database tools, is that there is a little bit of a residual needed knowledge to work with that database, right? So how I might write a cast statement inside of a SQL Server database might differ from a Redshift, for example. There might be different functions that might be available within your database. So there's going to be some prerequisite knowledge, but hopefully you don't have to do some incredible transformations inside of these formula tools where you're writing really verbose SQL statements, because that would be kind of contradictory to the idea of Alteryx and what we're trying to accomplish here. So let's just create a new field here just to show you what that looks like. And I'm going to say I'm going to calculate a transaction amount, which is simply going to be the multiplier on that unit price and the quantity they ordered. Here I could set the type, right? And this is where it's really important. If I wanted to write a cast statement, I could right here to kind of converge or transform, I should say, a previous field to a new field. I'm going to set that as double, and I'm going to insert some fields into this SQL expression. Now I could type them out by hand, but I find this to be a lot easier. I'm going to say, what's my unit price times quantity ordered new. We'll take a run on that workflow. So now you can see I have a net new transaction amount. Now that, for example, was helpful for us, but let's say I want to do a whole case statement in database and then filter on that, right? That's where a little bit more of that prerequisite knowledge comes in. So I'll just show you priority. Change this to vString in this case. And I'm just going to paste in this expression, right? Something that would not normally work in any filter or any formula tool inside of Alteryx. However, in database, right, I am adhering to my database standards. So I was able to write a formula in a way that I would write it nowhere else inside of Alteryx. I actually wrote it as the database would understand it, right? So when you think about in database, think about speaking the database language along the way. Now we're not going to use that field. I just did that more for the sake of demoing what's there. But let's go ahead and actually do our next step of analysis, which is basically saying I want to know kind of the total transactions spent by each customer. So each of those transactions, it was like unit price and the number they spent, but they could have had a large number of transactions along the way. So what I'm going to do is kind of summarize this data, and this is good because it's going to shrink the number of rows within my data set. So I'm going to say for each customer ID, I want to group by those customer IDs, what was the sum of transactions, and I'm going to rename that here. I'm going to bring this open a little bit more. Total transaction amount, and let's just keep a count of how many transactions there were. So now you can see I have a customer ID, a total transaction amount, and how many transactions were in that data set. So everything's coming in nicely, and now I've kind of got a lot of information on my customers and how much they've spent. But now let's bring that data together with my actual customers' files to see, how likely they are to respond to a campaign. And if they do, how much money are they worth to me, right? Which customers do I really want to target the most? So what I'm going to do here is let's go ahead and connect to a customer's file. And just give me a second while I navigate to this because it's buried deep inside my file system here. There we go. And you'll see in this data set, I've got my customer ID, which we're hoping will blend nicely here. Store number, the segment that these customers have kind of been aligned with, were they a responder to our campaign or not? This is going to be a really big one for us, right? We're trying to predict if these customers in the future will become responders to future campaigns. The number of transactions per year they have roughly, and some demographic information like their home value, their income, their financial institutions, what level of university they've gone to, so on and so forth. So now in this data set here, let me add a browse and just run this. I have 2,678 records, and here I have 100, right? So I could actually play this two different ways. I might think it's more optimal to bring this in memory because I have 2,000 over here and only 100 over here. So bring this part into memory, and as an analyst, I would choose that. But in this case, since I want to learn more about streaming in and streaming out of database, what I'm going to do is show you some in-database blends and how that's different. So what I'm showing is probably not the most optimal way, although both of these data sets are very small, but I just want to show you how to accomplish streaming in and streaming out. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure that all my data is auto-fielded nicely. If I go in here and look at my data, I can inspect the data types. I can see that everything looks pretty good, but I always like to do this as kind of a piece of security to make sure that Alteryx kind of auto-sets those data types. And then I'm going to stream it in. Now, this is anytime that you stream into database or write to a database, this is probably one of the, aside from connecting to data, outputting the data is probably the second hardest part, right? And usually it's not a problem. The only time that there's a conflict is based on the data types that you have available in your database versus the data types that you've assigned to these fields in memory, right? So making sure that, hey, if I'm overwriting a table where in database it's a v-string, but I've labeled it as a double inside my workflow, you have to make sure that everything's aligned to the target table to make sure the data types fit there. So in this case, it's not going to be a huge problem because I'm not kind of overwriting a table. What I'm going to do is just create a temporary table. Now, I do have to go through the little same song and dance of making sure that where I'm writing that temp table is in the exact same place. So I'm going to make sure that my live training demo is the place where I'm writing that temporary table. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that you'll need to make sure that your DBA has permitted you to do. If you fail on that and saying you don't have the requisite permissions, you'll need to make sure that you have the ability to create temp tables. So now what I've successfully done is taken a file that's sitting on my desktop, moved it into that SQL Server database as a temp table, and as soon as I close my session here in Alteryx, that temp table will disappear. So it is only living kind of for now. So I've created that temp table, and now we can continue to blend in database. So let's go ahead and get that information between the customers that I have here and here tied together via a simple blend. So I'm going to go to my in-database tool set and join InDB. Now, you will notice right off the bat that this join InDB tool is different very much so from the join tool in memory, namely that there's only one output. That's because in database, there's usually only 3 types, maybe 4 types. We don't really have the self-join if you want to get technical with the 5th type. But we have inner join, left outer join, right outer join, and full outer join. So you would actually set what type of join you want inside of that join tool. So in this case, an inner join, and a tie customer ID to customer ID. So now we're blended in database. We can go ahead and inspect that, see what it looks like. Looks like I've got about 100 I've cached 100 records. And that's probably something I should have done earlier. I know I misspoke about what might be more optimal. I actually wasn't looking at a full view of how many that I had inside database in terms of records since I was caching it. But anyway, back on the topic. So now I've got 100. I've got all my records joined together. It's time to perform some logistic regression. Let's predict if these people are going to be responders to my campaign. Now, what I can do here is I can actually go to my predictive data set and pull in a logistic regression, okay? And since I'm working in Microsoft SQL Server, I can go ahead and connect that right in and run that logistic regression. However, if you're working outside of those 3 databases that we spoke of earlier, you likely will not have the ability to do this logistic regression in database. However, that doesn't mean you still can't do logistic regression on your data, right? What I'm going to do is say, now that we've got our data blended together nicely, I'm going to pull that data right out of the database. And if you wanted, anytime you stream out, you can choose to sort it in a certain way. In this case, I'll leave it by default. And then come in and pull in the logistic regression. Now, many of you might be confused because how do I get this to be an in-memory logistic regression? Because every time I pull it in, it turns to an in-database tool. If you right-click on it, you can actually choose the tool version. And my tool version card, let's see if I can get it back on screen because it's coming up on the other page. Tool version, logistic regression, right? So now it's a nice clean one. I can connect green to green. So that's how I would go around it, and vice versa. If you wanted to convert it back, that's how I do it here. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's create a target variable. What's the likelihood that they're going to respond to a campaign? And I want to base this off of the region that they live in, and the income and the home value that they have, and how much of their total transactions they've had in the previous history. So I'm going to go ahead and add a browse to make sure that everything executes as expected here. Let that regression run. I'll pause here for a second just to make sure while this is running that I'm answering all the questions that are coming through. Okay. Looks like the questions are not many questions coming through yet. So the next thing that I want to do is actually kind of score against this model, right? Let's say this is obviously not how easy predictive analytics is because there's usually more of an exploratory phase and you're trying a lot of different variables. In this case, I'm saying I'm happy with the way I've created this model, and I'm actually going to score against it. So what I'm going to do first is I'm really interested in scoring people who haven't responded in the past, right? So I'm going to go ahead and filter out anyone who hasn't scored before. So were they a responder, and I want everyone where it's equal to no. Do note that the filter is pretty much the same in terms of having the same number of outputs. However, the custom filter experience is a little different, right? You'll actually have to insert the fields the same way that I have within, you'll have to insert these the same way I have inside the filter tool. So this should be good to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stream out this data as well for another thin data set. And I'm going to actually score this model. So I'm going to say, give me that object, and let me convert this tool version to the scoring tool as well. Give me this object. Boom, boom. Let me make sure I'm in the right place here. All right. Sorry, noodling around a little bit here. Give me the object, give me the data. Let's create a new field name called score. And then we'll just leave it as it is, and let's see if we get the result that we desire. Doesn't seem to want to be a fan of our workflow here. Let's just run it, see if it'll take. Now, one of the things that people should know about the R tools along the way is, since it's a set of code, sometimes it'll just try to evaluate before runtime, which doesn't necessarily mean that it will behave the way it's evaluated. So now I actually have my model score. Let's take a look, make sure that everything looks okay. So yes, here I have it where I can actually see here's my responders that are saying no. What's their likelihood that they'll continue to say no, or they'll say yes in the future based on some of their demographic information that we modeled above here. So now we've got a really full-fledged data set that we really like. We're going to pull that back into database because that's where we want it to live. So let's go ahead and stream that back in. Choose our connection again, right? Do we want to create a temporary table or a final table? And a lot of people will actually stream it in and write shortly thereafter. You can actually just create a new table there or overwrite a table. So this actually works kind of like an output or a save table function that we're about to visit. But in this case, I'll just do a temporary table and just say that we want to do one final step, right? So it's streamed in now. And what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to go back to in-database and do a quick sample. So I want to sample the first 10 records to say kind of who are my best responders. And I'll say for those of which who said yes, descending, right? So what this should do is give me the top 10 scores that said yes, and I'll run that. Now you will notice what is kind of nice about the sample tool in database is that you have the ability to sort and sample simultaneously instead of using two different tools to accomplish that. So what I would expect here is hopefully some of the best people to target for part of my campaign. So here you can see, based on my model, here are the people that have a pretty much 100% predicted value to say that they will respond to my campaign, all the way down to around 86%. So finally, let's get out here and just write out this output and say we're done. So I'm going to go ahead and write this data using the write data in DB. Connect to that. You'll see you have an option of how you want to output it. Do you want to append it to an existing table? Again, this one you'll have to be careful of because any time that you append, you'll have to make sure that your field name and type mappings are correct to make sure that everything seamlessly connects between the two. You can delete the data and append, overwrite table, create new table, or create a new temp table with this. In this case, I'm just going to create a new table, and I'll call this the live training demo table. You can see that there is an option to auto-config by name if you are set up correctly, or by position if your names are different. Now, one of the nice things about that tool is that if you are working in a transformative process where writing this table out is simply a stop point and you won't need to do something after you write that table, you'll see that there's this optional output anchor, if I add a browse to it, that will continue to carry data past that, right? So if I was simply saying this is step one, write this table or this temp table, and then continue on with my query, I could absolutely do that. Okay, and I'm not sure what errored there. Oh, because I'm creating a new table that already exists, so I need to make sure that I overwrite that table. So that's one thing to be aware of too. Once you create a table, you might, if you're setting just to do a complete drop and overwrite, that might be something you need to do along the way. So I know that was a lot of information, but we're coming up closer to the end of the hour here. So I'm going to toggle back over to our final slides and cover off on any more questions that we might have. So support resources, again, what's going to be really important is Alteryx community, especially as it comes to configuring these in-database tools. Also, since I said you need to speak a lot of that native language when it comes to writing filters or formulas, some people might have some insight there on ways to write that into your in-database statements. As always, we have Alteryx Academy, so if you want to try out other things, I don't think we have any weekly challenges or interactive lessons regarding the in-database properties, but if you did want to go back and review what happened here today, a playback will be posted. And then finally, if you do run into some issues that couldn't be supported via the Alteryx community and you just need some help along the way, go ahead and contact support@alteryx.com and they'll make sure you get on the way and you're supported in the way you need to be supported. So with that, that's it. My name is Joe Miller, and I thank you so much for joining today. In-database is a great add to your tool palette. You'll find that you don't need to have a wealth of knowledge to do it beyond normal workflows that you're doing today, but it is a way to greatly optimize some of the work that you are doing. So get out there, start shifting your compute context around, and I'll just hang on the line to see if I can answer any questions along the way. So there was a question in saying, what's the difference in using an ODBC connector or a Microsoft SQL Server option when setting up the DB connection? I'll say the Microsoft SQL Server option, it's a little bit more of a guided experience. It would still work in the ODBC connector setting, but what it's going to do is when I actually go to generate that connection string, it's only going to show me options that are really pertinent to Microsoft SQL Server versus the ODBC, which is going to basically give you everything to work with. And then also for some people, they might actually have custom connections built. So out of the box, we do have these supported ODBC connectors, but sometimes there's one-offs that they can actually use to connect into that. The question is, could there be terms and speed of a difference in terms of speed when getting the data? Honestly, I don't have a good answer for that. I would just give it the old A/B test and see if there's any difference. I would guess to say no, but it's always worth checking out. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. I'm going to wrap the session. I'll try to get this recording posted in the next few days. Appreciate you joining, and maybe we'll see you next week. Thank you.